Rain hammered the New York sidewalk like bullets, each drop exploding into 1,000 tiny shards that soaked through Scarlett's worn, scuffed old sneakers. She stood at the intersection on Fifth Avenue, one arm clutched tight around a plastic bag stuffed with discount groceries, the other pressed to her stomach, hiding the small curve that was steadily growing beneath an oversized, shapeless coat. The pedestrian signal blinked its countdown. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. But her feet felt nailed to the street, exhaustion sinking into her bones the way November cold seeped through every thread. 6 months. 6 months since Scarlett had signed the divorce papers with trembling hands. Since she'd walked out of the marble mansion, her prison. Since the last time she'd seen him. 6 months since she'd chosen freedom over chains plated in gold. Chosen poverty over suffocation. Chosen the unknown over the terrifying certainty of belonging to Gabriel Corsetti. The light turned red just as Scarlett stepped off the curb. A horn shrieked. Tires screamed against wet asphalt. She froze in the middle of traffic, the bag slipping from her numb fingers. A few oranges rolled across the crosswalk lines like little planets breaking free of orbit, and then she saw it. A black SUV with tinted windows, flanked by 2 identical ones. All 3 stopped at once with perfect synchronization, even though the light was green. The rear door of the middle car opened. Through the curtain of rain, through the distance of several car lengths, Scarlett recognized the Italian leather shoes first, custom-made, so absurdly expensive, so completely wrong for New York weather. Then the charcoal gray suit, tailored to fit as if it had been drawn onto the body. Finally, when he stepped fully out of the vehicle, ignoring the blaring horns and the confused pedestrians, she saw his face. Gabriel. Time collapsed. The rain seemed to hang suspended in midair. Every sound cut out, leaving only the pounding of Scarlett's heart, as if it might shatter her ribs. His dark brown eyes, the eyes that had once traced every inch of her skin, that had watched her with possession and something dangerous that was almost gentle, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her knees want to buckle. The faint scar ran along his collarbone, the mark of that failed assassination years ago, stark beneath his rain-soaked shirt collar, his square jaw clenched. Even from this distance she could see the muscle there twitching, could recognize the violence being held in check across the tense line of his shoulders. His tall 1-meter-88 frame coiled like a weapon. 2 men climbed out of the front seats, earpieces visible, hands already shifting toward concealed weapons as their eyes swept the intersection for threats. Gabriel lifted one hand, a small, almost casual gesture that froze them in place. His gaze never left her. Scarlett needed to run, needed to protect the secret growing inside her, but her body betrayed her, paralyzed beneath the weight of his stare, under the flood of memories crashing back without permission. The scent of his cologne, bergamot, cedarwood, and something darker, something that always reminded her of gunpowder and sin. The feel of his hands, gentle despite their capacity to kill, sliding along the curve of her spine in the bedroom's darkness. The sound of his voice, velvet wrapped around steel, whispering promises that were also threats. You belong to me, Scarlett, forever. A horn roared right beside her, snapping her back to reality. Scarlett staggered forward, her coat slipping askew, and everything shattered. The wind caught the fabric, pulling it tight against her body for only an instant, just long enough. Gabriel's expression changed. His eyes dropped to her belly, and Scarlett watched, helpless and horrified, as realization struck him like surf slamming into stone. His skin went pale beneath its tan. The hand that had lifted halfway, as if to reach for her, curled into a fist so tight the knuckles blanched, and even through the rain she could see it. No, Scarlett whispered. But thunder swallowed the word. His lips moved, shaping her name. Though she couldn't hear it over the chaos of the intersection, she felt it like a physical touch. The way his mouth formed those 3 syllables, the way he'd spoken them against her skin countless times, in pleasure and in rage, and in the perilous place between the two. Tony Marchetti, his head of security, leaned in close, speaking urgently into Gabriel's ear. The boss ground his jaw, his attention split between her and whatever information he was receiving. The light changed. Traffic began to move, flowing between them like a river of steel and glass, cutting off his line of sight. Scarlett ran. Her legs found their purpose again, carrying her across the remaining lanes, up onto the sidewalk, and into the maze of hurried pedestrians under newspapers held over their heads. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her she heard shouting, sharp commands in Italian, the heavy footfalls of men trained to hunt, to seize, to eliminate obstacles. Scarlett plunged into the subway entrance at 42nd Street, taking the steps 2 at a time, despite the ache in her lower back, despite the cramps in her calves, despite the 5 months of pregnancy weighing down every step. The station swallowed her, a concrete womb reeking of hot metal and bodies. An approaching train screeched. Announcements echoed that no one listened to anymore. The platform was packed with commuters heading home. Scarlett forced herself into the middle of the crowd, yanking her hood up, making herself smaller, invisible, everything she'd learned to become in the months before she escaped the Corsetti empire. The train arrived on a gust of stale air. Doors opened. People surged forward. Scarlett. His voice cut through everything. Through the noise. Through the crowd. Through 6 months of silence and the distance she'd worked so hard to build. She turned, unable to stop herself, and saw him at the top of the stairs. His suit was soaked through, his black hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, God, his eyes, those dark brown eyes almost black, burned with a violence of feeling that made her stomach knot. Fury, betrayal, and something else, something that looked almost like pain. 3 men in black suits stood behind him. Tony was speaking urgently into a phone, another man scanning the crowd with the focused, predatory attention of a professional killer. But Gabriel didn't move. He only stood there, tall and dangerous, water dripping from expensive fabric, staring at her as if she were a ghost he'd summoned out of his own nightmare. Their eyes met across the platform. The crowd surged again, pushing Scarlett into the train car. She pressed herself to the window, her palm flattened against the cold glass. She couldn't look away from him, even as the doors began to close. Gabriel moved, fast as a blade. The crowd parted in front of him as if he were Moses, and they were the Red Sea. No one wanted to stand in Gabriel Corsetti's way when he wore that expression. His men followed, shoving bodies aside with a professional efficiency that edged into violence. The doors slid shut at the exact moment he reached them. His hand struck the metal with a sharp, clipped sound that made nearby passengers flinch. His face was only centimeters from hers, separated by a sheet of glass and the 6 months of lies she'd built between them. His lips moved, shaping words she could see but couldn't hear over the rising hiss of the train. "You're carrying my child." Not a question, a statement, an accusation, a declaration of ownership. The train lurched forward, pulling Scarlett away from him, but his eyes stayed locked on hers, black with rage, and filled with a promise that turned her blood to ice. Gabriel drew out his phone with motions that were too controlled, too deliberate. She knew that look, knew what it meant when Gabriel Corsetti shifted from emotion to action, from feeling to hunting. When the tunnel swallowed the train into darkness, when the platform and Gabriel's silhouette vanished from view, Scarlett slid down along the wall of the car until she sat on the floor, knees drawn up as far as her 5-month belly would allow. Her hands shook as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with terror flooding her veins. Other passengers looked at her with varying shades of concern and annoyance, but Scarlett barely registered them. All she saw was Gabriel's face. All she felt was the weight of his stare, the promise inside his eyes. He knew now. After 6 months of running, building a new life in the shadows of the city where he ruled like a king of the night, protecting the small life growing inside her from the violence and danger that clung to everything Gabriel touched. He knew now, and Gabriel Corsetti never let go of what belonged to him. Scarlett pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the faint movements that had begun just the week before. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child who didn't yet know what it meant to be born into this world, into a war between freedom and possession. "I'm so sorry." The phone in her pocket buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times in a row. Scarlett didn't need to look to know who was calling. To know that right now his resources were being activated, his network being set in motion, his empire redirecting its focus toward one single objective. Find her. The train swayed through the tunnel, carrying Scarlett toward whatever destination she'd chosen at random, toward the temporary safety she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had once been the wife of the most dangerous man in New York, wouldn't last past tonight. Because Gabriel had seen her, had seen proof of what she'd hidden from him, and there was nowhere in this city, perhaps nowhere in the world, she could hide from a man who commanded darkness the way others commanded armies. The question wasn't whether he would find her. The question was what he would do when he did. If you want to know what Gabriel will do when he finds Scarlett and the secret about the child in her womb, leave a like on this video. Share it so people who love emotional drama can enjoy it too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. The apartment Scarlett had rented for the past 3 months sat in Brooklyn, perched up on the 4th floor of an aging building above a Korean grocery store, a place where people were used to not asking questions, and the wail of ambulances had become familiar white noise. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand gripping the railing that wobbled under her weight. Every step was a battle, her 5-month belly dragging her down, her heartbeat still refusing to slow since the moment she'd seen Gabriel step out of the black SUV in the rain. When the apartment door shut behind her, Scarlett slid 3 deadbolts she'd installed herself, then leaned her back against the wood and sank down until she was sitting on the floor. The small space that nearly stole her breath came into view under a weak yellow light. The ceiling was mottled with water stains from a leaking pipe upstairs, forming dull brown maps that looked like bruises on human skin. An old heater in the corner clattered as if it were trying to communicate in Morse code, pushing out a thin warmth that wasn't enough to chase the November cold clinging to her bones. The furnishings were so sparse the place looked like someone about to move out at any moment. A twin bed with sheets bought from a secondhand shop. A small table by the window facing the fire escape, where someone had left a few pots of wilting plants. 1 pot and 1 pan, inverted beside the sink. Nothing on the walls. Nothing personal. Everything had been chosen by one standard only, easy to abandon in 5 minutes. Except for one thing. An ultrasound photo taped to the bathroom mirror. A blurred black and white image showing the curve of a tiny spine, the shadow of a head. No. 2 heads. Scarlett stood, her legs still shaking. She went straight to the space under the bed and pulled out the travel bag she'd kept packed since the first day she moved in. Inside was cash, enough to survive for 2 weeks if she was careful. A fake ID she'd paid almost all her savings to get. A few changes of clothes, prenatal vitamins, a small knife she knew would be useless if she faced Gabriel's men. She began throwing more things into the bag, clothes from the closet, a toothbrush, the few books she'd allowed herself to buy, remnants of the person she was trying to become. A woman who read poetry instead of counting exits. A woman who slept without checking the locks 3 times. The phone in her pocket kept vibrating without pause. Scarlett pulled it out and looked at the screen. 17 missed calls, all from a hidden number. Gabriel was smart enough not to call from his own line, smart enough to understand how things could be traced or blocked. But she knew it was him, knew that behind every hidden number was his voice, his anger, his questions. Why didn't you tell me? How long has it been? Did you really think you could hide my child? She powered the phone off and shoved it to the bottom of the bag. Maybe she'd throw it away entirely. Maybe she would. The knock stopped her heart. Not a normal knock. Just one. Solid. Controlled. Full of power. The kind of knock that carried authority. The kind of knock from someone who was certain the door would open. Scarlett. His voice came through the steel door, low and restrained in a way that was even more frightening than if he were shouting. I know you're in there. I can hear you breathing. Impossible. The door was thick. The walls were solid. But with Gabriel, nothing was impossible. He had resources she couldn't even imagine. Spy movie technology. And most of all, he had the kind of power that made people tell him anything he wanted to know. The emergency bag was still in her hand. The window to the fire escape was only a few steps away. But she was 5 months pregnant, and Gabriel Corsetti was standing right outside her door. Go away, Scarlett said, hating the way her voice trembled. You don't have the right to be here. We're divorced. I signed the papers. Silence stretched for a few seconds. When Gabriel spoke, his voice was so low she almost had to press her ear to the door to catch it. Divorced. A quiet laugh followed, but there wasn't a trace of humor in it. That divorce got processed at record speed. So fast it's suspicious. I'm guessing you had help. Someone who knows how to push paperwork through. Someone who owed you a favor. It doesn't matter. It won't hold up under scrutiny. Scarlett's stomach tightened. She had asked someone in a law office for help. A woman whose brother had died because he'd gotten tangled up with the Corsetti family. The woman had handled everything quickly, quietly, before Gabriel's people could interfere. But if he was challenging it, even if you invalidate the divorce, she said slowly, I'm not coming back to you. Then we'll discuss that. But you will open this door, Scarlett. One way or another. She stared at the door. Solid steel. Multiple locks. A safety chain. She'd chosen this apartment specifically because it was defensible. But she'd chosen it to defend against street crime, not against Gabriel Corsetti. What if I don't open it? She asked. Then I'll have my men clear this floor. His voice stayed calm, as if he were talking about the weather. They'll evacuate every apartment, tell everyone there's a gas leak or a fire hazard or whatever reason gets them out quickly and safely. Then they'll break this door down." He paused for a beat. "I don't want to scare your neighbors or ruin your belongings, but I will if I have to." "You're insane." "No, Scarlett." His tone shifted abruptly, emotion leaking through cracks in his control. "I'm a father who just found out his child exists, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, I won't do to protect what belongs to me." Her hand went automatically to her belly. As if answering her father's voice through the door, through her skin, the baby gave a small kick. A faint movement she felt like betrayal. "I'm not your property anymore," she said, but even she could hear her voice weakening. "You'll always be mine. The divorce papers are just a temporary illusion I allowed you to nurture. I thought you needed space, time. I thought you'd come back on your own." His voice dropped lower, intimate in a way that made her skin prickle. "But this changes everything. You should have told me, Scarlett. You should have told me the moment you knew. So you could lock me up, use the baby to keep me your prisoner. So I could protect you both." The emotion in his voice was raw now, unhidden. "Do you have any idea how many enemies I have? How many people want to hurt me by hurting what I love? And you've been out here alone, vulnerable, carrying my child. Don't call it that. Don't turn our child into some Mafia succession plan. Our child." He repeated the words as if they were sacred. Silence stretched again. Then came a word she had never heard from Gabriel Corsetti in the 2 years they'd been married. "Please." Scarlett froze. Gabriel didn't say please. He didn't ask. He didn't soften demands with politeness. But the word was here, carried on a voice that sounded almost splintered. "Please open the door, Scarlett. I want to talk. Like adults. Like people who are about to be parents." Her hand moved toward the lock before her mind could catch up. This was what he always did, what he was always good at. Finding the weak point, applying pressure, making her doubt her own decisions. She'd spent 6 months learning how to be strong without him, learning that his protection came with a price that was too high. But she was so tired of being strong alone. "Don't move suddenly," she said. "Don't grab me. We talk like civilized people." "I'm always civilized with you, Kara." That was a lie. But she opened the door anyway. Each lock clicked back. The chain slid free. Her hand shook on the knob. Gabriel stood in the hallway, and the sight of him stole her breath the way it always had. His suit was still damp from the rain, clinging to his body in a way that made him look less like a businessman and more like something far more dangerous. Trapped inside expensive fabric, his black hair was slicked back. Water still beaded at his temples. But it was his eyes that caught her. Dark brown, almost black, filled with an intensity that made her knees want to give out. He looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze moved from her face down to her belly, lingering there with an expression she couldn't name. Then he looked past her shoulder, into the apartment, and she watched as a silent fury built inside him. His eyes swept the stained ceiling, the broken heater, the cheap furniture, the little stove where she cooked simple meals for one. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists, then opened again. And when he finally stepped inside, filling the cramped space with his presence, she saw in his eyes not only anger, but pain. Pain that she had lived like this. Pain that she had chosen poverty instead of staying with him. Gabriel stood in the middle of the tiny apartment, tall and out of place among peeling walls and cheap furniture. 2 men in black suits appeared at the threshold, but he lifted a hand in a single gesture and they retreated, disappearing into the hallway like trained ghosts. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a prison locking. They faced each other in the cramped studio, and the space suddenly felt impossibly small, with his presence filling it. The heater clattered. Rain kept falling beyond the window, and Gabriel Corsetti looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve, a possession he would never again allow to slip out of his sight. "Can I touch?" he asked quietly, lifting a hand toward her belly but stopping halfway, waiting for permission. His fingers trembled, and Scarlett realized this was the first time she had ever seen that hand, the hand that had killed, that had signed death sentences, that had held absolute power, tremble for anything. "No." She stepped back, her spine meeting the wall. "Not yet." His jaw tightened, but he lowered his hand, respecting the line she'd just drawn even though it clearly hurt him. His gaze stayed fixed on her stomach, where her coat could no longer hide the unmistakable curve of 5 months. "You're bigger than I thought," he said, his voice rough. "For 5 months." Scarlett drew a deep breath. This was the moment she'd feared for 6 months, the moment her last secret would be stripped bare. But there was nothing left to hide now. "Because I'm not carrying one," she said slowly, each word heavy on her tongue. "I'm carrying two baby girls, twins." Time froze. Scarlett watched as the truth hit Gabriel like a fist to the chest. His eyes widened. Color drained from his face. He staggered back a step, his shoulder striking the wall behind him. And for a moment, the most powerful mafia boss in New York looked like a man who'd just had the world yanked out from under his feet. "Twins," he repeated, a whisper. "Girls. 2 little girls." He lifted a hand and dragged it across his face, and Scarlett saw his fingers shake even harder than before. When he lowered his hand, his eyes were wet, not tears falling, but a thin sheen she had never seen on this man in the 2 years of their marriage. This was Gabriel vulnerable. Gabriel without armor. Gabriel she hadn't even known could exist. "You're carrying twins," he said, as if he had to convince himself it was real. "And you didn't tell me." She could have been angry. She could have defended herself. But looking at him there, leaning against the wall of her miserable apartment with wet eyes and shaking hands, all she felt was tired. Bone-deep tired. "I found out 2 weeks after I left," she said, her voice steadier than she thought it could be. "I went to a community clinic. The doctor told me I was pregnant, and I cried all night. Not because I didn't want them, but because I knew what it meant." "What did it mean?" Gabriel asked, his voice hoarse. "It meant I'd never be truly free." Scarlett walked to the cheap bed and sat down because her legs no longer wanted to hold her. For the last 6 months, she had been waitressing at a small diner in Manhattan, on swollen feet 8 hours a day, carrying heavy trays, enduring difficult customers and unwanted flirting. All of it on minimum wage. She had to stretch down to the last cent to pay for this apartment. "I used Medicaid," she continued when Gabriel stayed silent, listening. "Government health insurance. Your wife using public assistance for prenatal care." "Ex-wife," he corrected, but his tone held no argument. She looked at him and saw anger boiling under the calm surface of him, but not anger at her, anger at himself, anger at the situation, anger that she'd had to endure all of it alone. "I went alone every time," she said. "I sat in a crowded waiting room with other women, watched them hold their husbands' hands or their boyfriends' hands, and I sat there by myself. I heard their heartbeats for the first time by myself. I found out it was twins by myself. I found out they were girls by myself." Gabriel said nothing. He only stood there, braced against the wall, looking at her with eyes full of a storm he was trying to hold back. And in that moment, the tiny apartment, with its water-stained ceiling and broken heater, became proof of everything she had sacrificed for freedom, everything she had lost to keep her children far from his world. Silence stretched between them like a living creature, heavy and airless. Gabriel was still braced against the wall, but something in his posture had changed. His shoulders sagged. The familiar armor of the most powerful mafia boss in New York seemed to be cracking. "I failed you," he finally said, his voice rough as if each word were scraping his throat raw. "Whatever happened in our marriage, whatever made you feel like you had to run, I failed you, and I'm sorry." Scarlett looked at him, her heart tightening. The second apology in one night, from a man who never apologized, never admitted fault, never allowed himself to be weak in front of anyone. "I put you in a cage, Scarlett," he went on, his eyes fixed on the old floorboards as if he couldn't bear to face her. "A beautiful cage, a luxurious one, but still a cage. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I could control every variable, track every threat, you'd be safe. But instead, I turned you into a prisoner, not a partner." She didn't speak, only waited, because this was what she had wanted to hear for 2 years. The acknowledgement that his love had suffocated her, that his protection had become a prison. "Why?" Gabriel lifted his head, looking at her with eyes still damp. "Why didn't you try to fix it? Why did you run instead of telling me?" "Because I did tell you," Scarlett replied, her voice calmer than she felt. "I told you hundreds of times. I wanted to go out. I wanted friends. I wanted to work, to have purpose, to have a life of my own. And every time you nodded, you promised you'd change, and then everything stayed exactly the same. Bodyguards following me everywhere. Cameras in every room. Not allowed to go anywhere without an escort." She stood, her legs still trembling but her voice steady. "And then I found out I was pregnant, and I realized that if I stayed, my children would grow up in that cage. They would witness late-night meetings you never explained. They would see blood on your shirts that the cleaners never fully got out. They would learn that violence is how problems get solved. You think you can keep my children away from that? You think, Gabriel, the same way you thought you could keep me away from it. But darkness seeps into everything you touch. I don't want my children growing up in violence. I don't want them thinking it's normal. I don't want them becoming heirs to an empire built on blood and fear. Gabriel went quiet for a long time, absorbing every word. Then he nodded slowly, as if accepting a sentence. You're right. I can't promise a normal life. My world doesn't work like that. But I can promise I'll try. I can promise I'll give you a voice, choice, autonomy within safe limits. That's still a cage, Scarlett said. Then help me make it bigger. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar cologne through the scent of rain and city air. Tell me what you need. What would make you feel less trapped? Because I can't leave you here, Scarlett. Not because I want to control you, but because this apartment is in a building with a broken security system. In a neighborhood where I counted 3 drug deals just walking from my car to your door. You're carrying twins. A high-risk pregnancy. And you're living like you don't have a single person in the world. She wanted to argue, to say she'd managed, but she was too tired. Too tired of being strong alone. Too tired of worrying about rent and medical bills. Too tired of waking at 3 a.m. with back pain and no one to share it with. I need conditions, she said finally. If I go with you, I'm listening. I want my own space. Not in your penthouse. Somewhere else, where I can have privacy. Done. I want to make decisions about my life. No coercion. I agree. And tonight, I'm only going because I want your doctor to check the babies. If afterward I still want to leave, if I still think I'm better off without you, you won't stop me. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. His jaw clenched as if he were swallowing 1,000 objections. Then he nodded. One night, he said. You give me one night to prove I can change, and I won't force you into anything. It was a fragile agreement, built on mistrust and wounds that hadn't healed. But when Gabriel held his hand out, waiting for her to take it, Scarlett realized this was more than she'd ever had in 2 years of marriage. A choice, small and conditional, but still her own. The black SUV glided through New York's soaked streets, carrying them away from Brooklyn toward Brooklyn Heights. Scarlett sat in the back seat, keeping her distance from Gabriel even though the tight space made that effort almost meaningless. She could feel the warmth coming off him, could smell the familiar cologne threaded with rain. 2 bodyguards sat in front, eyes fixed on the road and the rearview mirror, so professional they were nearly invisible. No one spoke. Scarlett watched the city slide past the tinted glass, noting neighborhoods shifting from rundown to middle class to wealthy. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the faint movements of the 2 small lives inside her, as if they, too, were anxious about whatever waited ahead. When the car stopped, Scarlett stared out in surprise. This wasn't the cold penthouse of glass and steel she'd lived in for 2 years. In front of her stood a red brick townhouse with black shutters, green ivy climbing the walls even in the heart of winter. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and something about that image tightened her chest. It looked like a home. A real home, not a fortress or an art museum. You said you had somewhere else, she murmured, still unable to take her eyes off the house. I bought it 2 months after you left, Gabriel replied, his voice low and carrying something she couldn't quite read. I thought maybe if I had a place that wasn't the penthouse, a place without those memories, you might consider coming back. Scarlett turned to look at him, searching for the familiar signs of manipulation, but she saw only honesty in the dark brown eyes watching her. He had prepared for her return. Even believing she was gone forever, he had built a place for her. A bodyguard opened the door. Gabriel stepped out first, then held a hand toward her, waiting. She hesitated for a second, then took it and let him help her out of the car. His hand was warm and steady, and she hated the way her body responded to that contact, as if it still remembered, still wanted. They climbed the stone steps, and the front door opened before Gabriel could even touch it. A woman in her mid-50s appeared, round-faced with kind eyes and a warm smile. She wore an apron dusted with flour, and the smell of something cooking drifted out with her. "Welcome home, my dear," she said to Scarlett, her voice so warm it sounded as if they'd known each other for years. "I'm Gloria Chen. I manage this house for Gabriel." Scarlett didn't know how to react. In the penthouse, she'd had only chilly, professional staff, shadows who moved quietly and avoided eye contact. But Mrs. Chen looked at her with genuine concern, the kind of look her mother had once given her before she died in the fire 19 years ago. "I've prepared a room for you on the 3rd floor," Mrs. Chen continued, leading them inside. The whole floor is yours. A bedroom, a private bath, and a small reading room that looks out over the garden. Gabriel thought you'd want your own space. Scarlett stepped into the house and felt as if she'd walked into another world. Warm wooden floors, soft cream walls, furniture that looked comfortable instead of loudly expensive. A real fireplace burning in the living room, the fire's quiet crackle steady and gentle. Fresh flowers on the table, books on the shelves, not for display but for reading. And on the walls, no cold, untouchable art, only warm landscape photographs and a few small shelves holding handmade pottery. "I have hot soup in the kitchen," Mrs. Chen said, her hand settling naturally on Scarlett's shoulder as if they were family. "And fresh baked bread. You need to eat something before the doctor arrives." Gabriel remained in the doorway, not following her in, giving her space to adjust. And in that moment, with the warmth of the house wrapping around her and the scent of a home-cooked meal in the air, Scarlett felt something crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The clock on the third-floor bedroom wall read 2:00 in the morning, and Scarlett was still tossing and turning on the softest bed she'd slept in for the past 6 months. The room looked like something out of a magazine, with Egyptian cotton sheets and thick blackout curtains, but her mind wouldn't settle. She thought about the shabby Brooklyn apartment, about the life she'd built from ashes, about how all of it had collapsed in only a few hours. And she thought about Gabriel, in the room across the hall, only one hallway away and yet as distant as if he belonged to another world. A light knock startled her, not the kind of knock that carried power like it had at her old place. Just 2 gentle taps, cautious, testing. Scarlett sat up, pulling the blanket to her chest even though she was still wearing the pajamas Mrs. Chen had laid out for her. "Come in," she said, her voice rough from lack of sleep. The door opened and Gabriel stepped inside, holding a steaming mug. He traded the wetsuit for simple sleep pants and a t-shirt, looking less terrifying, looking almost normal. "You can't sleep," he said, not a question. "Neither can you," she replied. He came closer to the bed and set the mug of warm milk on the bedside table. Mrs. Chen said, "Warm milk with honey helps you sleep. And it's good for pregnancy." Scarlett looked at the milk, then at him. In the dim light of the room, she saw the shadows under his eyes, the new lines at the corners of his mouth. Gabriel Corsetti looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept well in a very long time. "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair by the window. She nodded, and he sat, keeping a respectful distance. Silence covered them for several minutes. Scarlett drank the milk in small sips, feeling warmth spread through her stomach. Gabriel looked out the window, where streetlights cast yellow streaks through the steady drizzle. 6 months, he finally said, his voice low and far away. 6 months I lived in hell, Scarlett. You can hate me as much as you want, but you should know what it was like when you left." She didn't speak, only waited. And for the first time in the 2 years she'd known him, Gabriel opened up. He told her about the sleepless nights after he realized she was gone, about how he turned the entire city inside out looking for her in that first week, frantic and desperate, about the anger at first, then the confusion, then the pure pain when he understood she truly didn't want to be found. He told her about meals he couldn't swallow, meetings where he sat but his mind was somewhere else, nights when he stood in her empty room in the penthouse and tried to understand where he'd gone wrong. "My men found you after 2 weeks, he continued, his voice going rough. "They reported you were safe, living in Brooklyn, working at a diner. And I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to leave you alone or drag you back." "Why didn't you drag me back?" Scarlett asked, surprised by her own question. "Because I realized that was the reason you ran in the first place." Gabriel looked at her, his eyes catching the dim light. "Because for the first time, I understood that loving someone doesn't mean owning them. So I only had people watch from a distance, make sure you were safe, and every day, I hoped you'd come back on your own." His voice sank lower. 6 months, Scarlett. 6 months I watched you from far away, knowing you were struggling, wanting to help, and not daring to interfere. That was my hell. Watching the person I love suffer and being unable to do anything. Tears rose before Scarlett could stop them. She wasn't crying because she pitied him, or maybe she was. She wasn't sure anymore. She cried from exhaustion, from the relief of finally having someone share the weight, from 6 months of being hard, and now she didn't have to be hard alone. Gabriel stood, moving to the bedside as if pulled by an invisible force. "Can I?" he asked again, lifting a hand toward her belly, waiting. And this time, Scarlett nodded. His hand settled on her stomach, warm and trembling. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his forehead nearly touching the place where their children were growing. And at that exact moment, as if they knew their father was finally here, one of the babies kicked hard. Gabriel went still. His eyes widened, then a second kick, from the other baby, as if both of them were greeting the man they'd never met. "They're kicking," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Scarlett, they're kicking." She looked down and saw the most powerful Mafia boss in New York kneeling beside her bed with tears streaming down his face, and her heart shattered and stitched itself back together into a new shape. She lifted her hand, trembling, and for the first time in 6 months, she touched his black hair, while they both cried for what had been lost and what might still be found. The next morning, Dr. Harrison Wells arrived at the townhouse at 9 o'clock, carrying a suitcase of medical equipment that looked expensive, and wearing the calm demeanor of a man who had seen everything over 20 years of practice. He was around 45, gray at his temples, with eyes that were sharp but warm. Gabriel introduced him as New York's leading obstetric specialist for high-risk pregnancies. And Scarlett didn't doubt it, once she saw the way he set up a portable ultrasound machine. With the precise efficiency of someone so fluent in his work, it had become instinct. They were in the second-floor living room, where Mrs. Chen had already arranged a comfortable chaise for Scarlett to lie on. Gabriel stood by the window, keeping his distance but never taking his eyes off her, tension visible in the hard line of his jaw. "Doctor." Wells began by taking her blood pressure, and Scarlett saw his expression shift when he read the number that appeared. Sophia, his nurse, a woman with warm brown eyes, wrote carefully on the chart. "Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like, doctor," Wells said, calm but serious. "Are you under a lot of stress?" Scarlett almost laughed. Stress. 6 months alone, overworked, worried about money and the future, and whether the father of her babies would find her. "You could say that," she replied dryly. Dr. Wells didn't comment, only spread cold gel across her belly and placed the ultrasound probe. The room went quiet for a few seconds, and then the sound filled it. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. 2 heartbeats layered together, fast and strong and so vividly alive that Scarlett's eyes stung. She'd heard that sound many times at the community clinic, but this was different. This time Gabriel was here, and when she glanced over, she saw he'd moved closer without realizing it. His gaze locked on the ultrasound screen with an expression she couldn't read. "Both babies are developing well for week 22, doctor," Wells said, shifting the probe to show different angles. "Baby A is a little bigger, which is common in twin pregnancies. Both placentas look healthy, no obvious abnormalities." Then he paused, his tone turning more grave. "However, I do have some concerns. Your blood pressure is elevated, and there are early signs of a condition that could develop into preeclampsia. Combined with a twin pregnancy and your stress level, I'm classifying this as high risk." "What does that mean?" Gabriel asked, his voice tight as a wire. "What do we need to do?" "Bed rest is the starting point." Dr. Wells looked at Scarlett. "Limit physical activity. No work, especially not jobs that require standing for long periods. Monitoring at least twice a week. A carefully controlled diet. And most importantly, lowering stress. Whatever is driving your blood pressure needs to be addressed." Scarlett braced for Gabriel's anger, for the accusation that she had caused this herself. That if she hadn't run, if she hadn't tried to survive on her own, their babies wouldn't be at risk. But when she looked at him, she saw only pain and self-blame. Gabriel didn't speak, but his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping. His hands curled into fists and then opened again, as if he were fighting himself not to react. He wasn't blaming her. He was blaming himself for pushing her far enough to run in the first place. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Wells asked, breaking the strain. Scarlett looked at Gabriel. He looked back at her. And in that moment, they weren't a mafia boss and a runaway wife. They were simply 2 people about to become parents, standing at one of the most important moments of their lives. "Yes," they said at the same time. "And Dr." Wells smiled for the first time since he arrived. He adjusted the probe, searching for the right angle. "Baby A is a girl, and baby B," he paused for a beat, "is also a girl. Congratulations. Twin girls." "Girls," Gabriel whispered, his voice shaking. "We're going to have 2 daughters." Tears slid down Scarlett's cheeks before she could stop them. 2 little girls, who might have Gabriel's black hair, or her own auburn brown, who might inherit his stubborn eyes or her smile, who would grow up and love and live, if they could keep them safe. "Have you thought about names?" Gabriel asked, moving to the side of the chaise. dropping to his knees so he was level with her. "I want to name one after my mother," Scarlett said, her voice thick. "Isabella, that was her name." "Isabella Corsetti," Gabriel repeated, as if tasting each syllable. "Perfect. And the other baby? I want you to choose." He went quiet for a moment, eyes on the ultrasound screen where two tiny shapes were curled beside each other. "Lucia," he said finally, his voice turning rough. "After my mother. She would have loved you, Scarlett. She did love you, and she would want to be remembered through her granddaughter. Isabella and Lucia Corsetti, two names chosen to honor women who were gone, but whose love remained. And for the first time since Scarlett ran 6 months ago, she felt a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could do this. Together. 3 weeks passed in a peace Scarlett hadn't believed could exist in Gabriel Corsetti's world. True to his promise, he kept his distance, knocked before stepping into any space she occupied, asked for her input instead of issuing orders. Every morning when she woke, fresh flowers were waiting on the table beside the bed, a different bouquet each day, as if someone were trying to learn what kind she loved. Her prenatal vitamins sat beside a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, and Mrs. Chen always had a hot breakfast ready the moment Scarlett came downstairs. Her blood pressure slowly steadied under Dr. Wells's care. The babies grew strong with each ultrasound, and Scarlett began to feel herself relax, little by little, like a fist slowly unclenching after being tight for too long. Gabriel started sharing pieces of his work, the legal side of it, real estate deals and investments she'd never been allowed to know about when she lived in the penthouse. They ate dinner together every night, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the thread that had been cut. And late at night, when neither of them could sleep, they sat in the library, Gabriel reading to her in that deep, warm voice, sometimes poetry, sometimes the fairy tales she'd loved as a child. On the 21st day, Gabriel told her there was something he wanted to show her. She followed him down to the basement, a place she had never entered, through a door that required a fingerprint and a code to unlock. Inside was his office, exactly as she'd imagined. Leather furniture, dark wood, computer screens, showing security cameras from all over the house. But none of that made her freeze. The wall did. The wall across from the doorway was covered with hundreds of photographs. Photos of her. Scarlett walking to the diner where she worked. Scarlett buying groceries at a discount store. Scarlett sitting in a park reading. Scarlett standing outside the clinic, a hand on her belly that was only beginning to round. Every photo had a date and time stamp, spanning the entire 6 months she'd been gone. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice shaking as she turned back to him. "You followed me. The whole time. I thought I was free. Thought I'd escaped. But you knew where I was every second of every day." "I needed to know you were safe," Gabriel replied, not a trace of remorse in his voice. "After you left, I nearly lost my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. My people started to worry, so I had you watched, just to observe, to make sure nothing happened to you. That's all. That's an invasion of privacy. That's obsession. That's madness. I know." He stepped closer to the wall, his finger brushing a photo of her laughing with a coworker at the diner. "But look at this." He pointed to one photo, marked with a date from 2 months earlier. She was standing outside the clinic, her hand on her belly. "I knew, Scarlett. Not consciously, but some part of me understood what that meant. My people reported you went to an obstetrics clinic more than once. I told them to back off, that you deserved privacy. But deep down, I knew." "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice still trembling. "You could have hidden it forever." "Because you said you wanted honesty." Gabriel turned to her, his dark eyes holding something she couldn't read. "Because if we're going to rebuild from the beginning, you need to know who I am. I'm the man who will track you through hell if that's the only way to keep you safe. I'm the man who can't let you go even when you ask. I'm the man who will burn this world down if anyone dares to touch you or our children." "Is that love or obsession?" Scarlett asked. "Maybe both," Gabriel admitted. "I don't know where the line is anymore. I only know that 6 months without you was hell, and I'll do anything not to live through that again." Scarlett stared at the wall of photographs, proof of a frightening obsession and proof of a love that couldn't be extinguished. And she realized, standing in that secret room, that she was in love with a man who didn't know how to love in a normal way. The question was whether she could accept that. Scarlett was still standing in front of the wall of photographs when Gabriel spoke, his voice dropping in a way she'd learned was the sign of bad news. There's something else I need to tell you. That's why I'm showing you this room today. She turned to him, her heart beating faster. The expression on Gabriel's face had shifted, from the open, vulnerable honesty of a few minutes ago, into something harder, more dangerous. This was the Mafia boss, not the man who'd knelt by her bed and cried when he felt his daughter's kick for the first time. Victor Santino, he said, and that name seemed to make the air in the room turn a few degrees colder. One of my oldest enemies. He's been consolidating power while I was distracted, looking for you for 6 months, and now he knows about you. About the pregnancy. Scarlett's stomach tightened. How does he know? Because in my world, Gabriel said, bitterness cutting through his words. Secrets are temporary currency. Someone talks. Someone always talks. He knows you're carrying twins. He knows you're living here with me, and he's making threats. Gabriel crossed to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside were photographs, but not the kind on the wall. These were shots of her walking in the garden behind the townhouse, taken from far away through a telephoto lens, her belly unmistakable in the sunlight. What does he want? Scarlett asked, her voice trembling even as she fought to keep control. The East Side shipping routes. Gabriel set the envelope down and looked at her with eyes holding a storm under restraint. He wants me to hand control of those routes over to him. If I don't, he's threatening to hurt you and the babies. Then give them to him, Scarlett said immediately. If that's all it takes to keep us safe. It's not that simple. Gabriel shook his head, exhaustion written across his face. Those routes are how I keep drugs out of some of the poorest neighborhoods in this city. Other crews want to use them to move heroin, fentanyl, things that are killing thousands every year. I control those routes not to make money, but to make sure they aren't used for destruction. If I hand them to Santino, he'll open the floodgates. Schools, parks, playgrounds, all of it will be saturated. Hundreds of people will die. Maybe thousands. Scarlett sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer willing to hold her. For the first time, she truly understood the complexity of Gabriel's world. Not black and white the way she'd always believed. Not only criminals and victims. There were gray zones she'd never imagined, where a mafia boss could be the one protecting poor neighborhoods from something even more toxic. So what will you do? She asked softly. I have a meeting with him tomorrow night. Gabriel's voice stayed measured. Neutral ground, with a mediator. I'll negotiate something that can protect you, and keep those roots out of his hands. And if the negotiation fails? Gabriel went silent for a long time, and that silence said more than any words could. Then he moved to her and knelt in front of her the way he had the first night, taking her hands in his. I need you to do one thing for me. Anything that's within my power. Marry me again. Scarlett stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. You want to get married while someone is threatening to kill me? I want to get married because if anything happens to me tomorrow night, you and the babies need legal protection. His words were steady, but something raw lived underneath them. My will, my assets, my legitimate businesses, everything is set up to go to my wife, not my ex-wife. If we're married, you inherit everything. You'll have the resources and the connections to protect yourself and our daughters. You're talking like you're not coming back. I'm talking like a man who prepares for every possibility. Gabriel tightened his grip on her hands. Santino is unpredictable, violent. The meeting could go bad. And if it does, I need to know I did everything I could to keep you safe. Scarlett searched his eyes for the familiar manipulation and found only real desperation. This man was preparing for the possibility of death, and the only thing he was thinking about was her and their unborn children. I don't care about your money, she said softly. I know. His voice gentled. But money buys safety, buys power. And in my world, power is the only thing that can protect you when I'm not here. He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it to reveal the ring she'd left behind 6 months earlier. The 3-carat diamond caught the light, throwing small rainbows onto the wall. I know I don't have the right to ask this. I know I haven't earned your trust back. But please, Scarlett, let me protect you the only way I can. And looking into his eyes, seeing the fear hidden beneath his controlled exterior, the desperate love in that gaze, Scarlett realized she couldn't say no. All right, Scarlett said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll marry you. But not for the money, not for legal protection, not for any practical reason you just gave me. Gabriel stared at her, dark brown eyes flickering with confusion. Then why? Because I still love you, she admitted, and saying the words felt like dropping the weight she'd been carrying for 6 months. I ran because I was afraid of your world, afraid of the cage you built around me, afraid of the violence and the secrets. But I never stopped loving you. And if tomorrow could be your last day, I don't want you facing it without knowing that." Gabriel rose and pulled her into his arms, with a gentleness she'd forgotten he could possess. He held her tightly but carefully, mindful of her belly, and she felt his heart pounding fast and strong through the fabric of his shirt. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I've always loved you, even when I loved you the wrong way." 4 hours later, the townhouse library had been transformed into a wedding room. Mrs. Chen, with astonishing efficiency, had turned the space into something out of a fairy tale. Hundreds of candles sat on every surface, their flames flickering and dancing against walls lined with books. White roses filled crystal vases scattered through the room, their sweet scent mingling with the smell of old paper and polished wood. There was none of the showy extravagance of their first wedding 2 years ago, with hundreds of guests and society pages in every paper. Tonight there was only necessity, sincerity, and perhaps the love they had lost and found again. Scarlett wore a simple cream dress Mrs. Chen had found from somewhere, the soft fabric skimming her pregnant belly. Her hair fell loose, auburn brown curls resting against her shoulders. No heavy makeup, no glittering jewelry beyond the engagement ring Gabriel had just placed back on her finger. She looked beautiful, in a way she had never felt at the first wedding. Beautiful because she was herself, and not a role. Gabriel stood by the fireplace in a black suit without a tie, looking both like a groom and like a man preparing for war. The scar along his collarbone showed beneath his open collar, a reminder of the dangerous life he'd chosen. But his eyes, when he watched her enter, held only love and the fear of loss. Judge Robert Hayes, a dignified man around 60 with silver hair and an air of steady authority, stood between them with a small book in his hands. He didn't ask why the wedding was happening in the middle of the night or why there was no family present. Perhaps he owed Gabriel a favor, or perhaps he was used to strange requests from this world. Mrs. Chen stood as the witness, her eyes red in the candlelight. The ceremony was short and simple. No music, no bridesmaids or groomsmen, no long speeches, only vows, the old words of love and commitment that millions of couples had spoken before them. "Do you, Gabriel Corsetti, take Scarlett Bennett to be your lawful wife?" "I do." Gabriel's voice was steady, his gaze never leaving hers. "This time and every time after, if you'll allow it." "And do you, Scarlett Bennett, take Gabriel Corsetti to be your lawful husband?" Scarlett looked at the man standing in front of her. The man who had locked her in a golden cage and then learned how to open it. The man who had watched her like an obsession and then admitted it. The man preparing to face death, while worrying only about her and their unborn children. "I do," she said. When Judge Hayes declared them husband and wife, Gabriel bent to kiss her. Not a passionate, possessive kiss like the one at their first wedding. This kiss was gentle, careful, as if he feared she would break if he pressed too hard. And when he lifted his head, she saw his eyes were wet again. After Judge Hayes and Mrs. Chen discreetly withdrew, they went up to the 3rd floor, to Scarlett's bedroom. Gabriel offered nothing beyond simply being there with her, and she was grateful for it. They lay side by side on the bed, not touching except for their fingers intertwined. Outside the window, the city stayed awake under millions of lights, indifferent to the war about to unfold in its shadows. "I want Isabella to learn piano," Gabriel murmured into the night, his voice soft in the quiet room. "And Lucia, I think she'll like drawing. I'll hire the best teachers." "You're talking like you'll be here to see all that," Scarlett replied, tightening her hand around his. "I will be here," Gabriel said, but she heard the uncertainty beneath the steadiness. "I promise I'll come back to you." To the girls. "That's an order," Scarlett said. "You're not allowed to do otherwise." Still issuing commands like the old days. He smiled in the dark, and she felt the smile more than she saw it. They lay in silence after that, listening to each other breathe, feeling the warmth of one another's bodies. And somewhere in that stretch of time, Scarlett drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, for the first time in 6 months feeling truly safe, even knowing the storm was waiting for tomorrow. Early sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains and woke Scarlett in the morning. And the first thing she noticed was the emptiness beside her. The spot where Gabriel had been was cold, telling her he'd been gone for a long time. She sat up, her heart racing with that familiar anxiety, and that was when she saw the note on his pillow. Gabriel's handwriting, strong and slanted forward like the man himself, cut across the white paper. "I love you. I'll be home before dinner. Don't worry. Don't worry." As if she could do anything else while knowing her husband was walking into a meeting that might end in death. Scarlett pressed the paper to her chest, feeling its sharp edges bite through the thin fabric of her pajama top, and she knew this would be the longest day of her life. The hours passed like thick drops of honey. Mrs. Chen tried to distract her with a generous breakfast she barely touched, with gentle conversation she couldn't focus on, with arranging the nursery for the girls that she couldn't get excited about, even though she would have loved it under different circumstances. She moved through the townhouse like a ghost, stopping at every window to look out at the street, hoping to see the familiar black SUV appear. Isabella and Lucia shifted constantly in her belly, as if they could feel their mother's fear. Scarlett laid a hand over her stomach and whispered to them that everything would be all right, even though she didn't believe her own words. The clock struck 6 o'clock in the evening, and her phone rang. Lenox Hill Hospital's number lit up on the screen, and her heart stopped for one endless beat. "Mrs. Corsetti?" A professional female voice came through the line. "Your husband has been brought to our hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact." The world tipped under her feet. "What happened? Is he all right?" "He's stable. A gunshot wound to the shoulder. He's asking to see you." Scarlett didn't remember how she got down the stairs, didn't remember where Tony came from to take her to the hospital, didn't remember what Mrs. Chen said as she hurried after her to the door. All she knew was the pure panic flooding her veins, and the wordless prayer that he had to live. He had to live. He'd promised he'd come home. On the way, Tony told her what had happened, his voice tense but controlled. The meeting had taken place in an abandoned warehouse at the docks, neutral ground both sides had agreed to. Gabriel arrived with his team. Santino arrived with his. The negotiations started tense and only got worse. Santino demanded too much. Gabriel refused to surrender the shipping routes. He proposed an alternative, Tony said, eyes fixed on the road. A deal that would give Santino certain benefits without impacting the neighborhoods. But Santino didn't want compromise. He wanted everything or nothing. "Then what?" Scarlett asked, her voice shaking. Santino pulled a gun. Out of nowhere, in the middle of the negotiation, no warning. He shot the boss before anyone could react. Bullet to the right shoulder. Our men locked it down immediately, but the blood, there was a lot of blood. And Santino? The FBI showed up. Tony allowed himself a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Turns out the boss arranged it in advance. He knew Santino might do something insane, so he contacted someone he knew in the FBI. Santino was wanted on multiple federal charges, and the boss made sure they knew exactly where to find him. Santino was taken into custody on the spot. He's finished. Gabriel had planned for everything. Even the possibility of being shot, he'd had a contingency. He'd contacted the FBI, arranged for his enemy to be arrested no matter how the negotiation ended. That was Gabriel Corsetti. Always 3 steps ahead, even with blood running from his shoulder. The car stopped in front of the hospital and Scarlett ran inside, despite the weight of her belly pulling at every step. The hallway blurred. The elevator moved too slowly, and then she stood outside his room, her hand trembling on the handle, her heart pounding like it might burst. She drew a deep breath and stepped in. Gabriel sat up in the hospital bed, his back propped against stacked pillows, his right shoulder wrapped in white bandages already stained with a thin rim of red at the edges. His face was pale beneath his tan, his lips dry, his eyes exhausted, but he was alive. He was breathing. He was looking at her with those dark brown eyes she'd thought she might never see again. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse and weaker than usual, but still his voice, still the Gabriel who was hers. Scarlett couldn't speak. She crossed the room in a few steps, ignored the visitor's chair, ignored every instinct for caution, and threw herself into him. She held him tight, careful of the injured shoulder but firm enough that he'd feel it. She was here. She was real. She wasn't going anywhere. And then she cried. The tears she'd swallowed all day finally broke free, soaking the shoulder of his hospital gown. She cried from fear, from relief, from anger, from love, all the tangled emotions she couldn't separate. Gabriel wrapped his good arm around her, his hand rubbing slow circles over her back while she sobbed into his chest. "I'm here," he whispered, his lips brushing her hair. "I'm here, Kara. I came back." When her shaking finally eased, Scarlett lifted her head, looked into his eyes, and punched his uninjured shoulder. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to make the point. "You promised you'd be home before dinner," she said, her voice trembling through the last of her tears. "You promised you wouldn't make me worry. You promised." "Technically," Gabriel replied, a faint, weary smile flickering at his mouth. "I'm here, and you can bring dinner to me." She hit his shoulder again, a little harder this time. "This isn't the time to joke, Gabriel Corsetti. You were shot. You were shot, and I had to hear it from the hospital instead of from you. I thought you—" She couldn't finish. The words caught in her throat, and all she could do was shake her head, her lips trembling. Gabriel lifted his hand and wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb. "I'm sorry," he said, and she heard the sincerity in his voice. "I didn't plan for Santino to shoot me. The plan was to negotiate, stall long enough for the FBI to get into position, then let them take him. But he was faster than I expected. I underestimated how crazy he was. Where is Santino now?" "In the FBI's hands," Gabriel said, a small spark of satisfaction lighting his eyes even though his body was clearly drained. "He's facing enough federal charges that he'll never see daylight again. The threat is over, Scarlett. You and the babies are safe." "Safe?" she echoed, bitterness still sharp in her voice. "Until the next enemy shows up? Until the next negotiation goes bad? How many times am I supposed to live through a day like today, Gabriel? How many times will I get a call from a hospital? Or worse, from the morgue?" Silence stretched between them. Gabriel watched her, his expression shifting from defensiveness to thoughtfulness, then into something set and determined. "I'll step back," he said finally. "Slowly, gradually, but I'll step back. I'll hand things over to people I trust. I'll focus on the legitimate businesses. I can't walk away completely because that's not how this world works, but I can move out of the front line. I can stop being the man every enemy wants to kill first." "Do you mean it?" Scarlett asked, not daring to believe, and not daring not to hope. "I mean it." Gabriel took her hand and squeezed with surprising strength for a man who'd just been shot. "I want to be there when the girls grow up. I want to see Isabella play piano and Lucia paint. I want to walk them into graduations and threaten their first boyfriend. I can't do any of that if I die in some abandoned warehouse because a negotiation went sideways." Scarlett looked down at their hands laced together, his rough hand wrapped around her slender fingers. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe a man who had lived by violence could learn to live differently. "I don't need you to promise perfection," she said softly. "I know you can't change completely overnight. I just need you to promise you'll try. Promise you'll really try, not just say it to calm me down, and then keep doing the same things." "I promise," Gabriel said, his voice steady, even as his body stayed weak. "I promise I'll try. Every day. For you. For Isabella and Lucia. For the family I didn't know I wanted until I almost lost it." Scarlett nodded, tears rising again, but these were tears of hope instead of fear. She climbed onto the hospital bed, careful of the IV lines and his wounded shoulder, and curled beside him the way she had the night before. Gabriel held her with his good arm, and they lay in silence in the sterile room, listening to the monitor count his heartbeats in a steady rhythm. Outside the window, the city lights began to come on as dusk fell, and for the first time since their story began, Scarlett allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have an ending that wasn't tragedy. 3 months passed in recovery and rebuilding. Gabriel healed a little more each day, the wound in his shoulder slowly closing into a scar that became another reminder etched into his body, alongside the older scar on his collarbone from the failed assassination years ago. But this time was different. This scar marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. True to his word, he began to shift power gradually, handing the most dangerous responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, focusing more on legitimate businesses. Scarlett watched the change take shape day by day, in the way he spent more time at home, in meetings that happened over the phone instead of in dark rooms at secret locations, in the way a smile appeared more often on a face that had once seemed permanently tightened by tension. They rebuilt their relationship on new ground, not control and possession, but conversation and compromise. They still argued, sometimes fiercely, but they argued like partners instead of like an owner and what he owned. Gabriel learned to ask instead of command, learned to listen instead of only protect. Scarlett learned to trust again, learned to demand what she needed instead of enduring in silence. The nursery was finished in the last week of February, the walls painted a warm, pale yellow, 2 oak cribs set side by side, stuffed animals and toys neatly arranged on shelves. Mrs. Chen knitted 2 soft blankets, one blush pink and one lavender, to tell the girls apart. And Scarlett began to call the townhouse home without hesitation or second-guessing. One March morning, when the first spring sunlight began to chase the last winter chill from the air, Scarlett was eating breakfast with Gabriel in the kitchen when the first pain hit. She froze mid-bite, a spoonful of oatmeal hovering in front of her mouth, and felt warm fluid run down her legs. "My water broke," she said, her voice strangely calm even as her heart hammered. "Gabriel, my water broke." Everything after that moved in a controlled whirlwind. Gabriel had been preparing for this moment for weeks, with a bag packed, the car always fueled, and the hospital already notified about Scarlett's high-risk pregnancy. He was frighteningly calm as he helped her into the car, his hands steady, even though she could see his jaw clench with every contraction that made her wince. 8 hours. 8 hours of pain and waiting and hope. Dr. Wells was there from the start, calm and professional, monitoring every number and making sure both mother and baby stayed safe. Nurses came and went, checking, recording, changing IV fluids. But the only person Scarlett truly saw was Gabriel. He stayed at her bedside every second, held her hand through every contraction, murmured encouragement into her ear when she wanted to quit. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said when the pain peaked, and she thought she couldn't endure one more moment. "You survived everything, your childhood in the orphanage, the years you fought your way through alone, 2 years with me, 6 months by yourself. You can do this." And she did. At 7:17 in the evening, after one final push that felt like it tore her in two, Isabella arrived. Her cry filled the room, strong and outraged, as if she were protesting being pulled from warmth and safety. "Doctor." Wells placed her on Scarlett's chest, and Scarlett looked down at the tiny life with wet black hair plastered to her head, fists clenched tight, a red, wrinkled face scrunched in fury. Scarlett was crying. She didn't know when it had started, tears spilling freely while her daughter kept wailing. 12 minutes later, Lucia came. Unlike her sister, Lucia didn't cry at birth. She was silent, eyes wide, looking around with curiosity, as if she were trying to understand what this new world was. "Doctor." Wells checked her quickly and nodded, reassuring them she was perfectly healthy, only different in temperament from her sister. Scarlett held both girls in her arms, Isabella still whimpering and Lucia still watching, and she felt her heart stretch to hold a love she hadn't known could exist. Gabriel stood beside the bed, so quiet she had to look up at him, and she saw him, the powerful Mafia boss, the man who had killed without blinking, crying, not sobbing, not making a sound, just silent tears sliding down his cheeks as he looked at his wife and daughters, with an expression she could only call absolute awe. "Do you want to hold them?" she asked softly. Gabriel nodded, unable to find words. A nurse helped place Isabella in his arms first, guiding him on how to support her head and lift her small body. He stared down at his daughter, his fingers trembling as they brushed her cheek, and Scarlett saw his lips move, whispering words in Italian she couldn't understand, but she knew they were promises. Then he switched to Lucia. The baby stayed quiet, still watching, eyes dark and identical to her father's. Gabriel bent and kissed her forehead, his tears dropping onto the blanket wrapped around her. And in that moment, Scarlett knew that despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and fear and months of running, she had made the right choice by coming back. The first days with 2 newborns were a kind of chaos Scarlett had never been able to imagine. Sleep became a luxury measured in broken 2-hour scraps. Isabella's cries would rise the moment Lucia finally drifted off, and then Lucia would wake just as Isabella settled, as if the sisters had secretly planned it to make sure their parents never truly rested. But it was also the sweetest chaos she had ever lived through. Gabriel, against every expectation Scarlett carried, didn't step back from the challenge. She woke at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd night, after they came home from the hospital, found the space beside her empty, and discovered him in the nursery. The most powerful Mafia boss in New York was standing at the changing table, clumsily trying to fasten a fresh diaper on Lucia, while the baby stared up at him with curious eyes, as if she were judging her father's competence. The diaper sat a little crooked and the tabs weren't secured quite right, but Gabriel smiled at his daughter, spoke to her in soft Italian, and Scarlett stood in the doorway with her heart melting. He wasn't perfect. He was still the controlling, overprotective man he'd always been. Still had moments when he slipped back into old instincts when faced with threat or uncertainty, but he was trying, every day, and that was all she had ever asked. Mrs. Chen became the girl's unofficial grandmother, helping without taking over, letting Gabriel and Scarlett learn to be parents in their own way. There were nights they argued about how much the babies should eat, about whether to let them cry for a minute or pick them up right away, about 100 tiny decisions new parents have to make. But they argued and made up, learned and adjusted, getting through each challenge together. A year passed so fast, Scarlett could hardly believe it when she looked back. Isabella and Lucia learned to crawl, then to pull themselves up, then to take those first wobbly steps across the townhouse living room. Isabella, always the bolder one, fell and got up, until she could cross the room from one end to the other. Lucia, more cautious, watched her sister for a long time before deciding to try, and when she finally walked, she did it right the first time as if she'd studied it carefully. The townhouse filled with children's laughter, with babbling that wasn't quite language yet, with toys clattering against the floor and small feet pattering over wood. Gabriel came home earlier each day, often carrying a new toy or a picture book he'd found somewhere. He lay on the living room floor with his daughters crawling over him, letting them pull his hair and grab his nose, laughing as if it were the best thing in the world. Scarlett would often stand in the doorway and watch a scene she once believed could never happen. Late one night, when both girls were sleeping and the house had fallen quiet, Scarlett and Gabriel stood on the third-floor balcony, looking out over the city glittering below. Her shoulder leaned into his warmth pushing back the cool edge of a spring night. "I didn't think I'd ever be this happy," she said softly, her eyes still on the distant lights. When I was living alone in that apartment, I only wished for peace. I didn't dare wish for happiness." "Happy how?" Gabriel asked, sliding an arm around her shoulders. "Like this." Scarlett turned to look at him. "A real home. A man who truly loves me, not just wants to possess me. 2 healthy children, and a future I can see without fear." He bent and kissed her forehead. "I'm sorry for the years I took from you, the years you were afraid instead of happy. I don't need you to apologize anymore." She turned fully to face him. "I need you to keep trying. Keep being this man, this father. That's all I need." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the dark, listening to each other breathe and to the distant sound of a city that never slept. Inside the house, through the baby monitor sitting on the balcony table, they could hear Isabella and Lucia's steady breathing, those 2 small lives that had changed everything. This wasn't a fairy tale, Scarlett thought as she leaned into her husband's arms. There was no perfect prince and no spotless castle. Gabriel was still a dangerous man with a bloody past. She still carried scars from an orphaned childhood and 2 years trapped in a golden cage. Their relationship still demanded effort every day, still held hard moments and disagreements, but this was better than a fairy tale, because it was real, not perfect, but honest. Not easy, but worth fighting for. They had rebuilt from ashes, 1 brick at a time, and the home they'd made might not glitter like a storybook castle, but it was solid. It was warm. It was theirs. And that, Scarlett realized as she lifted her eyes to the few stars visible through the city's glow, was what made it perfect. Scarlett and Gabriel's story closed here, a journey from darkness into light, from fear into trust, from loneliness into family. The lesson they left us was about forgiveness and second chances, about how real love isn't always perfect, but it's worth choosing, day after day, about how the past doesn't define the future, and every person is capable of change if they truly want it. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, please give us a like to support the channel. Share this video with friends who love emotional stories, so they can experience this journey with us too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tap subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new videos every day. We'd truly love to hear what you feel deep in your heart. What did you think of Scarlett and Gabriel's story? Have you ever lived through a moment when love and trust were tested? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll read and reply to every single one. Finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and a heart full of love each day. We hope you find peace within yourself and happiness in the simplest things. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.